Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. And welcome back to our afternoon session today with our conference. And we're very glad to have Dr. Derrick Sebree to lead us in his talk this afternoon. Derrick, to me, is a Renaissance kind of person. He has such diverse interest in he has his hand in so many different kinds of diverse projects that feed each other, that are in such a creative and new way. I'm very glad that we're gifted to have his presence with us this afternoon. Dr. Sebree is a clinical climate psychologist, and I know you probably I haven't heard that phrase a whole lot, but delighted to hear it and hope to see it so much more. And I hope Derrick will speak to this and how vital it is for us to be paying attention to our role in climate crises and our relationship of justice to our environment. Dr. Sebree is also an American Descendant of Slavery core faculty member at the MA program at the Michigan School of Professional Psychology. With Division 32, he is one of our members at large and the co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Dr. Sebree is an engaged practitioner and organic intellectual, as he is also very much on the ground in the Detroit community, working towards social justice and addressing such crises as food insecurities. Dr. Sebree sees the whole picture, historically and macro-systemically. So we're very gifted to have his presence with us. And his presentation is "We Shall Rise, Critical Praxis for the Socioecological American Descendants of Slavery." Dr. Sebree.
Thank you, Todd. I don't think I've ever had a introduction in a way like that, so I really appreciate it.
I could go on and on and on if you want, but I'll save your time.
Okay, so I'm glad to be here today, I think, with everyone. So I'm going to share my screen. And so my presentation today, when I think of critical praxis, I guess I'm always thinking of context, right? I'm always talking about with students, with supervisees, with anyone, the importance of context, whether that be culturally, historically, I think spiritually. You can just really go through, I think, the list, because context is it's part of what creates, I think, the human experience. It's what is really allows us to say we can see one another's points of view, we can understand where somebody is coming from, because you really are understanding, experiencing somebody's context, empathizing with somebody's context. Right? And to do that, I think it really requires us to look at and witness other people's contexts. So today, as a part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about my own context, and really, I think, in a way that we don't really hear about very often, and talking about that in the context of, American chattel slavery, going through, 400 years worth of oppression, just really talking about, okay, what does it really mean for someone to experience all of these pieces? And what does it really mean when we actually qualitatively root it within the experience of someone, right? Talking about systemic forces, but how are we seeing those systemic forces actually impacting generations of people's lived experience? And what does that mean for us today as we come to work with folks from American descendants of slavery, and sometimes Black American populations, which you also hear called, right? And so in this experience of still undergoing continued oppressive forces and struggles, and so how do you actually come to understand somebody who walks in your door, right? And so I'm hoping to provide that experience with this presentation. Let me share my screen. Oh, it says I can't share my screen. I think it says the host has it disabled.
Derrick, you should be able to do it now.
Thank you. Okay. And so thinking in this way.
It's still not working?
No, it is. I just
Okay.
need to switch my screen over. Computer difficulties. I feel like technological difficulties are a common part of our lived experience these days. So let me try that again. And here we go. Okay. And so I guess I start with this statistic. So Black American adults are 20% more likely to experience serious mental health problems, such as major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. And so I start with that to really just start with maybe a more zoomed in frame of what we're talking about. And so being very specific at first, right, in the sense of saying, this is where we're seeing the impacts of years of historical trauma, oppression, and continued struggles showing up, right? Showing up in terms of mental health, right? And so we see 20% more likely to experience serious mental health problems. Right? That doesn't even include what's the likelihood of actually getting access to those services needed to address those issues and so forth. But I use this as a frame to say, okay, this is as we're going through this presentation, this is what I want people to be thinking about, right? In the sense to say, because we're going to be talking about the impacts of white supremacy, the impacts of those systems in terms of economics, in terms of issues related to ecological and environmental injustices, and then various social injustices as a result of dealing with 400 plus years of white supremacist oppression. And so I start with, in the sense of talking about the systemic pillars of white supremacy. And so Jason in 2020 came up with really this 4-part model of looking at white supremacy. And so how do we actually understand what white supremacy is? By looking at the systemic inequities and how those systemic inequities are driven. And so it was found that there was really 4 pillars of that. And so the first one being race-motivated impairments. So race-motivated impairments would be things that we already maybe more easily identify as being racialized. So that might be things like stop and frisk policies. That'd be other policies in terms of, thinking driving while Black, thinking other policies related to, economic offsets. I think of things like divestment within communities. So like within Detroit, Louisville, there's been so many, various ADOS communities that have been impacted by race-motivated impairments, right? So things that are policies, laws, practices, social orders that are specifically about, impacting people on the basis of race. Right, so we see things like segregation in the past, Jim Crow, antebellum period of, slavery pieces, and just seeing how race-motivated impairments have always been a more, I think, overt part of the white supremacist structure. Right, it tends to be the things that people, I think, see on the surface. But the other pillars sometimes are a little bit more tricky. Right, so thinking about race-motivated benefits, that would be various systems that are in place for the purpose of, offsetting, maybe various racial issues. But the struggle with race-motivated benefits is they're often not contextualized. Right? And so thinking about context again, if they're not contextualized, then it might be something like, okay, we're going to give, we're going to give a group of people more access to this versus others. But instead of creating a offset, it actually just furthers the disparity. Right? It'd be like we're going to give everybody a stimulus check. Right? But we're not giving people stimulus checks based on equity of where they are, what their context is within, within the society. And so it doesn't actually offset, those issues. It's just kind of more of a one-off. Right, but then someone can say, well, you've gotten these advances, you've gotten these benefits, and so why is that a big deal, right? And we do hear that sometimes, like thinking a lot about how racially beliefs about, Black people in the United States taking too much, right, in terms of saying, hey, you got advances. Why are you continuing to push? Right? Didn't we offset enough with all of those advances? Right? And so that's where I think that race-motivated benefits starts to show up more in terms of proliferating that system, that culture of white supremacy. And so then the third pillar of that is talking about colorblind impairments. So that might be things that we see policies that, as a nation, as a US culture, gets put across the board, right? So it might be things like, oh, hey, we're going to raise the tax rate for everybody, right? Everyone's always talking about, oh, is my tax going to go up? Is it going to go down? Right? And so we're just going to raise that for everybody. But if you think about it, it's kind of the same as when we're talking about those race-motivated benefits, right? And so those colorblind impairments are more disparate against groups like, American Descendants of Slavery, right? And so then it becomes another, kind of add-on to that whole systemic oppression, right? But now it's guised in this way that says, well, everybody's had a tax hike, so everybody has to deal with that, right? But again, it proliferates and erases the already systemic oppression that is there, right? And so again, proliferating that system, that culture of white supremacy. And the last pillar on this list, as you see, is colorblind benefits. Right, and so thinking colorblind benefits, again, might be across the board saying we're going to give everybody a, a boost. We're going to say, all right, everybody's going to have $500 extra in their bank account, right? And so again, I mean, and I think we've seen that with, unfortunately, the last several years of COVID, in that sense of, if you give somebody a stimulus check and they already have 400 plus years of historical oppression, economic divestment, plunder, you're not actually really addressing the root of the issue. If anything, you're just kind of saying, okay, here's what we can do in this moment right now. Right, but then again, it proliferates that same system because it keeps proliferating the problem, right? Because now people can say, well, Black people have gotten, these kinds of advancements. Black people have gotten some kind of reparative justice. So why do we need to focus more on that? right? And then the picture I chose for this is important, I think, because I think really it creates the systemic impact of folks can't breathe because there's literally someone, a boot or foot, whatever it may be, really pressing on them, pressing on their bodies, pressing on all modes of life in that way, right? And so really creating restriction. And so, as a part of that, I talk about also kind of the characteristics of what we see in terms of white supremacy culture. And so here is really just some identified kind of traits that we tend to see. And so I often bring this up, like when I'm teaching students too, because I think when we're talking in terms of humanistic psychology, I think a lot of these are aspects that humanistic psychology really tries to push against and tries to move outside of, thinking of things like perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, right? And these are things that we would be working with clients with, helping clients find ways to move past, right? Find ways to kind of address those ways of maybe perceiving, thinking, experiencing the world that are maybe creating some issue for them, right? And so it's not that different when we're really thinking in terms of white supremacy culture, because a lot of it is based on, as you can see, really like either or thinking, black or white thinking, and a lot of these kind of being those beliefs, those thoughts that we're really trying to help people explore and maybe even challenge themselves to work through. Right, I can think of many times working with clients, all clients, no matter, regardless of color, in a sense, in really dealing with some of these aspects, right? And a lot of this being because of, the societal culture here, right? And the focus on a lot of these beliefs. But here we're kind of seeing the focus on those beliefs is also part of what creates this white supremacy culture. Right, and I think especially last year, thinking January 6th, what happened on the Capitol. And so really seeing that there's a culture when we're talking white supremacy. It's not just, I think often it's hard for people to see, right? It's like wind in the sense of I can't reach out and touch it. So I don't know if it actually exists, right? But it's like, no, this exists. It's just shows up in a lot of the ways in which we approach each other, right? The ways in which we approach the world. And so, it makes me think of a lot of the, doing a lot of my research, really coming across a lot of articles, a lot of academic pieces that really try to shed a little bit of light on how even white supremacy culture, I think, shows up within healthcare, right? For those of us working clinically. And what was that study in 2020 by Sabin said, so this was a quote from it, it said, Black people experience less pain. And so that being a common held myth among white medical students. And so part of the quote said, half of white medical trainees in the study believe such myths as Black people have thicker skin or less sensitive nerve endings than white people. And an expert looks at how false notions and hidden biases fuel inadequate treatment of minorities' pain. And just thinking, even like recently being on Twitter and just seeing other people I know within the ADOS Black American community, and this is a real thing that people talk about. Like someone described an incident of going to see a doctor, and the doctor said, "Oh, I thought, I just thought that you didn't feel that much pain, right? And I didn't think that was, and this was an older doctor, and he didn't think it was an issue." And the individual was like, "Oh, well, I'm gonna leave and go find another doctor," right? Because part of that really sets an unsafe tone, right? And really presents an issue of danger in the sense of, okay, is my doctor actually gonna listen to me if I say I'm having struggles with primarily health challenges, right? And so really seeing how white supremacy culture shows up in institutions, it shows up in medical settings, it shows up in healthcare, right? And so that's how it manifests, right? It manifests in the interactions and the gatekeeping, of people. And so as a part of this, this is a image that Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream company put out. And so for them, yeah, you're really presenting the piece of, we're talking about 400 plus years of oppression, just taking multiple forms, right? Starting with slavery, moving to Jim Crow, moving to redlining, housing discrimination, other practices, and then finally kind of being in this era currently of mass incarceration. And so as a part of this, really talking about, so again, the contextual aspect and the specific aspect of really the American descendant of slavery experience, because really when we're talking about slavery in the United States, we're talking about chattel slavery. Right, and it was the most common form of slavery known to the Americas. And the system is really what allowed people to be considered legal property, to be bought, to be sold, owned forever, and that being lawful and then supported by powers that be, right? Whether that be the United States, European powers as well, from the 16th through the 18th centuries. And so we're really talking about a change in really the procedure when it came to slavery within, the Americas, and specifically the United States. And so here's another graphic to just really illustrate, again, in a different way, 400 plus years of oppression, right? And people take different, I think, takes with it and really think about it differently, right? So here you don't really see redlining mentioned, but it really probably be included between the segregation and the mass incarceration, time periods. And so this is a portrait, Civil War era fugitive slaves, and who were recently emancipated around after reaching the North, right? So crossing the Mason-Dixon line, going more up into northern states. And this is the mid 1860s, right? And so the photos, everyone here really would often really be lumped together. And so people who were freshly emancipated, it's not like they necessarily had anywhere to go, right? And so that's kind of a part of when we're thinking about the end of slavery, in that sense that slavery kind of had this quiet kind of fizzle, right? And so a lot of what happened after that was there were no systems in place to say, okay, how do we relocate, and how do we really establish these people who have been unestablished in this country for their entire livelihood, right? And there's really nothing done at that rate. And so a lot of times folks were just kind of band together, right? Come together into part of their already known family units and also their housing units, right? The people who live together in the same plantations and same slave houses, but often they're all emancipated at the same time. And so they're like, well, we should all go there. We should all go somewhere together. Right. And so really seeing, as you even look through census records, you'll often see a lot of the census records within 1860s onward, and that probably 40-year time span until the 1900s, looking at folks in housing units. So saying, okay, if you all live next to each other, then you're all like in the same house, right? Or you're in the same area next to each other, you all live in the same house. Right, and this was, again, 1860s, so 100 years later is 1960s. Right, and then just keep going time frame wise. And that sense that it's not that far off. Right, and so this is a this is a picture of a scene from a movie that's coming out. It's called Alice. It's coming out this year. And so really it kind of is a play off of that idea of Alice in Wonderland. And so the sense of Alice is actually enslaved, and so she is on a plantation, and then in the woods she escapes the plantation, runs to try to get away, pops out onto a highway. And then this is the scene in the sense where there's a truck coming down the highway. And so Alice has no idea that this is the time period that she's in. So the movie is kind of a play because it's saying, okay, hey, look, Alice time traveled from the era of slavery to now in the 1970s, right? In the sense of saying, wow, like to have that much of a time jump, but it's a play because it's saying that it's not also at the same time. And so what we know is that really within until 1975, people, and in that sense I say people, I mean ADOS, Black American people, were being still enslaved, right? Still being made slaves, just not in the sense of chattel slavery, right? Because slavery as an institution was never made illegal, right? Just a lot of the components and processes were made illegal. But different forms of slavery, not so much, right? Because it's kind of more about, at that point, apples compared to oranges, compared to bananas. And so this is a quote from Letter in 2018. So he says, Harrell has uncovered numerous examples of white people in southern states entrapping Black workers into peonage slavery. Slavery justified and enforced through deceptive contracts and debt rather than claims of ownership, right? Because the idea of owning somebody was you can own somebody, right? But if you indebted somebody to you and contracted somebody to you, right, then that's different, right? And so now it was technically outlawed in 1867, 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. But that didn't really, the enforcement of that never really, I think, set foot. There were no people there that said, okay, hey, like we really need to keep an eye on these kinds of things. We need to protect these groups. And so people often enslaved through peonage probably didn't appear in any ledgers as belonging to enslavers. So that's another layer in the sense of really thinking about people who were not even counted. They were erased from those ledgers because it wasn't considered, the same, right? In the sense of saying, oh, well, this is not chattel slavery, so it's different. But it was often indistinguishable. The practices, the violence, during that antebellum period was pretty similar in those cases as well. And so, that kind of brings me to this piece of really talking about Black existentialism, right? Because this is the basis when we're talking Black existentialism. We're talking really that lived experience of terror, of violence, of being, ripped and put somewhere, right? And so this idea that these are all part of that lived experience now, right? Especially now that we're saying that experience and that livelihood within the United States has not changed very much. And so now, how does that factor into the Black American ADOS existence, right? And so thinking in terms of Black existentialism, right? And so I think initially it was humanistic existential psychology, really asserting that we all have personal agency, choice, and meaning. But then Black existentialism came in to say, I'm going to challenge that, right? If we're thinking people like Frantz Fanon, Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, like just people who have spoken out to try to challenge that notion of not everybody lives the same reality, right? And if we're talking about Black America, that reality is very different, it's very specific. And so it really calls for that critical perspective, right? And so really looking at what are the impacts of systemic oppression on the Black lived experience, because you can't separate the two, right? In the sense you can't say that, and I think it's interesting because, you know, having talks with folks who look into existentialism sometimes, like talking about that idea, like, you know, if you're, you know, a Black American in these days, you don't necessarily have the same relationships to personal agency, choice, and meaning that somebody who's a white American does, right? Which is a very different reality, especially we're talking about, again, contextualizing it clinically. A client walks into an office, we can't assume that the client is going to have the same outlook and the same experiences and relationships to these existential givens, right? And I think that's what has often been thought, is that everybody has that same relationship, although somewhat different. But we're saying now, Black existentialism wise, there's that relationship is forever changed by those experiences and that relationship to oppression. Right, and so really saying the Black human experience in the United States is inevitably linked to the experience of white supremacy. Right, which is, I think that's something you don't really see when we talk humanistic existentially, is really saying that, right? And because that is the context, that is the qualitative experience there, right? It's not, and existentially, sometimes it's a dark one, right? Often a dark one with that. Yeah, so really that idea of two Americas, and we hear that talked about, it's been talked about for more often in the last probably 6 years, right? But really thinking in this example, so, you know, the right with, again, the, you know, what happened in the Capitol on January 6th of last year, and then also looking at, you know, protests for like Black Lives Matter, right? And seeing really the difference in the response, really the difference in the enforcement of legislature, the enforcement of law, right, on different groups, right? And really seeing, I think, within the last 6 years, things being called to a stark reality over and over again. And I think often a shocking reality for folks who are not, who that is not a part of their lived experience already. Right, so this is a quote from James Baldwin. So I'll read it. It says, "It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the country to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everyone else, has not pledged allegiance to you." Right, and I think that's an important piece, because I think that's often a huge part of what ADOS Black America is really looking for is, okay, we want the protections, we want the same treatment, we want the same access. Right? And that's really always been the message there. Right? But that message keeps sometimes getting erased or kind of morphed or changed or kind of transformed into something different. And so in this image on the right, this is an image of Black sharecroppers. You know, so often what would happen, you can find videos. There's a woman on Twitter whose grandmother, I think, is like 96, and her grandmother was a slave, and so her grandmother will often talk about her experiences, and so this woman will often take videos and then post it, you know, post tweets. And so I think there was probably like a couple months ago, she had posted one and was talking about how if you were a Black sharecropper, so, and this was after emancipation, so you would work on the farm, right? You'd work on a farm is somebody's farm hand. Typically it would be, a white landowner. And so say, yeah, you come to do the work, come to pick cotton, do all of those things. And so end of the day comes, boss comes out and says, you did pretty good work today. I can give you 10 cents. Right. And so thinking 1860s, 1870s, 10 cents, definitely a different value amount than what we're thinking today in terms of things, but still not very much. Right. And so, but then the next trick with that would be, then they would turn around and say, well, I have to charge you. I have to charge you for the tools that you use. I have to charge you for the equipment that you use of mine. And so then they start taking away those pennies. And then often folks would be left with like maybe 1 to 3 pennies by the end of the day. And so imagining you do probably 12 hours worth of hard physical labor and you get paid 3 pennies. Man, that's supposed to be for your whole family, right? To buy food, to be able to ensure housing, right? And so really seeing how even after slavery, there was, again, no system in place to say, now we're going to elevate this group of people who have been historically oppressed. And instead, no, people are going to find ways to kind of work through that and still enact the same white supremacy culture. And so now giving you this backdrop, at least some of the historical context, I'm going to shift and talk about a different kind of historical context. And so I'm going to talk about the historical context of my family and really my family's placement within all of this, which I think is something we don't talk about very much. I don't think very many, I'll take that back. I'd say a lot of American descendants of slavery, Black Americans have these stories. It's just also putting it all together and pulling everything together. It's not always there, right? And there's not always all the facts to be able to pull everything together. And so it does take a lot of work, right? Like, and so, I'm going to talk about my experience. Also really doing a lot of genealogy, right? And so really looking into my own family's history to really start to be able to contextualize, okay, where was my family and my family members during these times? Like what was happening to people, right? Because I want to be able to have that lived experience and honor that context, right? And honor ancestors, right? With that. And so what is like, to do that means really examining your own history, right? Which is something I don't think happens as much. Right? I went to ancestry.com. I had already years ago had signed up for like a trial, right? But thinking a lot of those access to those things are behind paywalls, right? Memberships, having to have money that folks might not have access to, right? And they likely don't have access to, right? So Ancestry did they did create a search database for looking at African American family history. And so being able to look through what we call slave schedules. So I'm going to talk about that piece in a bit as that relates to really looking at my family history. But so here are these 3 pictures of, women within my family, within my family lineage. So the individual on the far right was my second great grandmother on my grandmother's side. And so people would often, so my grandmother talks about it to this day, like, so people called her Big Mama, and that was her name. And so she had several kids. But the interesting part of that is that, so we're talking about around the time frame of 1860. And so like I mentioned earlier, right, those pictures of the Civil War, fugitive slaves and the sharecroppers, that was the era that my second great grandmother was in. Right. And so really living within this post-slavery inching into the Jim Crow era. And so, my second great grandmother, she, an interesting part too, she was often a lot of the census documents really reference her as being white, some reference her as being mixed. But in terms of when you're talking census at that age, the term was mulatto. That usually that was how mixed people were referred to, which today is not a term that we would use to refer to mixed heritage people. But in that sense, like my whole family, like there's a family culture and a family history of being mixed heritage, which when we're talking US chattel slavery, that is already often a part of it. But because of the laws and placements, a lot of children out of those kinds of relationships are still put into slavery, right? And still considered slaves. And so my second great grandmother, she lived in Alabama, grew up in Alabama. And my great grandfather, Shady Ballard, was, her son. And so my great grandfather ended up deciding he met his wife, my great grandmother, on that side, and then ended up deciding to move to Michigan. And part of the experience that I often heard kind of growing up was that, my second great grandmother had a lot of kids, and she was like a farmstead. So she often did a lot of farm work. I mean, most folks in that era coming out of slavery were probably farmhands, cooks, house hands, housemaids, right? Just having to get into white spaces to be able to make money, right, to survive. And so my grandmother often would tell me stories about how my great grandfather, they didn't have like really lights in their house. They didn't even really have a floor, right? And just really there being a dirt floor, right? And so living in that very poor, impoverished life, right? And so my great grandfather decided to move to Michigan. He's like, okay, we got to have something different, right? And so a lot of folks, that is also around that time of kind of the Great Migration. So a lot of Black American folks really moving from the South into the North to say, okay, we need access to different kinds of institutions, and a lot of Southern institutions at that time being seen as, okay, and enacting, violence and discrimination and, different oppressive forces. And so people were like, well, there's got to be opportunities, there's got to be jobs in the North, right? So thinking like Big Three, auto plants. So my grandfather moved up to Michigan, with my great grandfather moved up with my great grandmother, and he built our family house here, and which that being a very huge thing, right? If we're talking Black Americans typically not having access to land ownership, and even having land taken, right, after buying land for themselves, especially if it was found to be valuable, right? If it found to be, hey, there's resources on this land that we want, so we're just going to take it. And so he moved up to Rolick Township, Michigan, built our family house, right? And I think my great grandfather had, I think he had a third grade education. That was really as far as he went in school. But he managed to come up here already with the family, starting a family, and built a house, right? And with amongst all of these oppressive forces, right? And so really looking at these shining examples of just more than resilience, but the want to prosper and the want to be established and to live life in the way that you want to live life amongst all of these oppressive forces and struggles, right? Very kind of Frankl-esque tragic optimism in that sense. But that's often, it's like before I even heard of Frankl, that was just kind of part of my understanding of living in that sense, because of having that relationship with systems of oppression in my lived experience. Right, my family saying, you got to find your space and do what you need to do and keep moving, right? Keep moving forward. So also a very humanistic concept, I think, in that sense, right? Continue growing, continue pushing, right? Regardless of those forces. And so the individual in the middle is one of my great aunts. And so her name is Henrietta Ballard. And so she was actually my second great grandmother's whenever, this would be one of her grandchildren. And then the individual on the far left is my second cousin, once removed. And her name is Karen, Karen Ballard. This is older photo of her, I think in the 1970s. And so she would be one of the great grandchildren of my second great grandmother, right? And so really starting to pull together, what is that family story, right? How do we witness the oppression if we don't know the stories, right? How do we honor the families if we don't know the stories? So this is a picture of one of the slave schedules. So US Census, right? And like I was saying, in the 1860s, now you've got all of these freed slaves, and no one said we're gonna methodically set up systems so that people can be, placed in environments and homes, and we can provide the scaffolding to help these groups lift themselves up. Instead, what happened was, okay, now we've got all these freed slaves. Now we have to start counting people, right? Like, we gotta keep track of all these people now, right? In the sense of now they're not somebody else's property. Now they're considered people. And so there was a large degree of, like I said before, counting households, counting people in residential proximity to each other, but also starting to, you would see a lot of documents about slave owners, right? And slave owners, how many slaves they owned, even down to pricings. You would start to see all of these pieces. And so, the interesting part is this looks like an Excel spreadsheet, right? And so these were made, Excel spreadsheets come from this, right? In the sense of finding ways to account for large amounts of people in an organized fashion, right? And so creating these kinds of sheets to say, now we can catalog, right, at a greater degree. And so in the red box, you can't see it, it says Silas H. Ballard. At the top, that column is called the name of the slave owner. And so I found that Silas Ballard was likely one of slave owners within a family lineage somewhere. And this was related to, so I mentioned my second great grandmother. This was related to her husband, so my second great grandfather. This is a slave schedule for him and other family members at the age of 5. Like for him at the age of 5, that was when he was freed, right? He was born as a slave and got freed at age 5, right? And then next generation is my great grandparents. Next generation is my grandparents, right? And so forth, right? So being able to see, again, this is not that far back, 1860s, and it's not that far ago. But also seeing now, it's different to start tracking the actual history of, somebody's slave legacy, right, in the slave lineage. And so these are pictures. So the older gentleman in the middle, that's my great grandfather. So that's Shady Ballard. This was his, I believe, like 92nd birthday. He died at age 93, so he died not long after this. And so the photo on the far right, and you might be able to identify somebody within that photo with giant glasses on his face, giant glare. So that is me. Probably, I think at like the age of like 8 or something like that. And these are all my cousins, right? And so these are all his great grandchildren, right? And so him being pictured here. And so I did not know much about him because really around the time I was able to start interacting with him, he passed not that long after. But one of the things I remember most was that, so all of my great aunts and uncles were we're kind of locked in a little bit of an argument with him because he still wanted to drive. He was like, I'm not giving up my keys. They're like, you're like 90. You need to not be driving. He's like, I'm gonna do what I want to do. You don't tell me what to do. So he was a very strong-minded person, right? He would always, he always wanted to, really be doing what he wanted to do. And so often his name that he would get called was, Big Daddy, right? So Big Mama and Big Daddy. And so in some of the other pictures, so this top left one is him with his, those would be his grandchildren. And then this is him with his cake. He was very much, I think he was a sports fan, he was a baseball fan. And then the smaller picture in the middle is actually him with all of his, with his other like grandchildren, his granddaughters. So one of them is my mom. She's like on the far right. And so this was in the family home. So this was in that home that he built, right? This was his house. And so this is a master plan of Roanoke Township, where my family's from. I want to probably emphasize just more so that it started off as an area of 36 square miles, largely, predominantly American Descendants of Slavery community, Black American community. Now it's down to less than a square mile. In 2022, the size of it is probably like probably like 3 or 4 blocks. Right, and so really seeing again like these issues of divestment, white supremacist policies that really changed the lived experience of Black Americans. And so this is a picture of, as you can see, a elementary school class. So the individual that's in the red, that's my grandmother. So this was her in her elementary school photo. And if you notice, predominantly large degree of white children, some Black children. So part of the story is that my grandmother, being born in the 1940s, she was born really into the era of integration. And so by the time she was in high school, she was going to an integrated high school. Right, and so again, seeing how those eras of segregation, that's not that far behind. Right, this is still very fresh, still very new. I can talk to my grandma about those stories and she remembers them like yesterday. Right, so again, this is like the cultural context that people are coming into therapy. They're coming into different institutional spaces. They're coming into relationship with us and other people with. And so this is a picture of a very popular family-owned corner store in Roanoke Township called Squall's. And so it's still open to this day, although there's been some kind of issues with, the kind of between the township and the store itself. But it was a store that was around since my grandmother was a child, since my mother was a child, and since I was a child. I've gone to the store before, right? And they sell penny candy. And you don't see a lot of places that sell penny candy anymore, right? And so being able to walk in, see giant vats of candy, and just, I'm gonna pick, the ones that I want. Right, and this was, this was really, I think, a kind of a staple institution within the community, right? This being one of the really Black-owned businesses within the community, which was really big, right? And it's still big to this day. But what we found recently in 2020 was that, there was a recent case in the news at that time about 2 homes in a rural township testing positive for lead. Right, so thinking of Flint, Michigan, Benton Harbor, right now talking about environmental injustices and really seeing how those are still showing up, right? And those are still a part of communities, even though they don't get publicized. And so if individuals wanted to test for lead, like within their water, so it was basically said like, okay, the government was like, we'll give you lead testing kits, but there's a catch. So to qualify, a home must be connected to Roanoke Township's water supply, which makes sense. Have a pregnant woman and or child under the age of 18 living or spending considerable time in the home, and be on WIC, Medicaid, or willing to say that you cannot afford the cost of a water filter. Right, and so putting these pieces in place, so now only certain residents within the city, and there's a large elderly population within the city, right? Because a lot of them are folks who, again, migrated, right? And their parents migrated up from southern states, right? And settled here to work factory jobs and work, other jobs within Detroit and places like that, right? And so they're not under the age of, they don't have maybe children under the age of 18 in the home, right? There might not be a pregnant woman in the home, right? And so again, restricting really the ability to even have the test to find out if you have lead, let alone go to the point of actually advocating for some kind of, environmental justice initiatives, right? Can't do that if there's really no way to test. Right, so again, really, there's that, I'd say that kind of showcasing one of those pillars of white supremacy, right? Like, yeah, we're just kind of going to make it a little harder for you to do this, even though it doesn't have to be this way. And so these are some other pictures. So individual on the right, in the bigger photo, that's my grandmother. Her name is Florence Meredith. Florence Ballard was her maiden name. And then the bottom left, the far right is actually my grandmother still. The middle person is actually my aunt, so my grandmother's daughter. And then the person on the far left is my grandmother's niece, right? And so really my family has always been rather close. And if you notice, I mean, I think in my family culture, there's really, like when we start talking about other pieces like colorism and stuff, that part's usually not a part of the picture because my family has a very big mix of like skin complexions, right? And so, and then the top photo is my cousin. So my group and my generation. So people really born alongside me. And so really just seeing my family has always really worked to try to come together in different ways and kind of be a unit, which I think is a very insulating and important coping strategy for, Black American ADOS communities, because we're seeing in that sense, especially if you think of, writers like like Bell Hooks, and she would often talk about the importance of the home place, and the sense of saying your home is where you get to come and you get to be, then you're in charge. This is your safe zone. This is where you get to have that joy and have those experiences that you don't get out in the world because of that oppression. Right. And I think that's an important factor too when working with, clients from this background, right? Because home life is important, maybe sometimes more important than other pieces, but also dealing with limitations based on experiences with systemic issues. And so I was talking about ancestry, right? And so this is my family tree on one note thus far. So here I am down here, very bottom. My mother right here, my grandmother right here, and then my grandmother. So my great grandparents actually had they had 9 kids, right? And so my grandmother was one of those children, and they all lived in that house in Warlock Township. And that was right where they were planted. Some of them lived there for like most of their lives. Like I think my great uncle lived there really all of his adult life. And so, as I was saying before, I wanted to illustrate because here's the area of where I really started to identify that, okay, this was the 1860s, 1850s, right? So really talking slavery era and end of slavery era. And so, like I said, my second great grandmother, the one that you saw in the picture, was, alive in that time period. My second great grandfather was born a slave, was freed. And then going up another generation, that generation, I believe was, actively slaves, right? They were actively slaves. They had not been freed, just thinking of the time frame, the Emancipation Proclamation hadn't gone through yet. And so it hadn't even come up yet. And this is, as I went that far back, it became much harder to start to find records. A lot of time getting into documents being erased, things being burned, lost, for different reasons, or just never made in general, right? In the sense of not thinking that there needs to be records kept of, these folks and their experiences. And so really thinking and seeing, again, in my lineage, my experience with my family's lived experience with slavery is not that far back, really like 3 generations, right? Which is very stark. And so these are some other pictures of some other members of my family. So this on the right, this is my great uncle. This is my great uncle Buddy. It's like most of the people in my family probably have a different name, right? They have some kind of nickname or some kind of other name that really people refer to them as. Just because some people also had, the same name as like my grandfather. And so like you would see, so my great uncle Buddy. Then there's also like my great uncle Carl, and my great uncle Eddie. But Eddie was his middle name. His first name was Charles. Right. And so my family always had many stories of really, I think, being a very close unit in a lot of ways. This individual on the top left, that's my great grandmother. So that's Big Mama. That's one of the Big Mamas. And then again here in the middle. And then on the left here on the bottom, this was my great aunt Loretta and her, one of her daughters and then her husband at the time. And so really, so as part of getting ready for this presentation, and really as a part of just continuing my own want to look in my family lineage, I went over, I was like, hey, Mom and Grandma, can I come over and look through all the family albums? And they're like, yeah, sure. And so really looking through and taking these pictures, and sometimes hearing the stories related to some of these pictures. I'd say, so that photo of my great grandmother up here, that is again, their house. That's that house that my great grandfather built. Right, I remember seeing that microwave as a kid. I remember seeing that dresser, all that kind of stuff. And so again, then this being, so up top left is a picture of my great uncle Robert. And then bottom left again, another picture of my great aunt Loretta. And so these are all of my grandmother's siblings. And so really it's, and as part of, I guess, zooming back to some of those statistics and really zooming back to that first slide, right? Talking about Black Americans having 20% more likelihood of having experiences with things like major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety. A lot of my great aunts and uncles really, they had their struggles. You know, so the period, there's issues of substance use in my family, right? And really, I come to see that, and the contextualizing and the humanizing of that is that this was really the result of dealing with being in these oppressive eras and these oppressive times, right? And not having access to resources, you know, economic stability, right? And really feeling that. And so this is a picture of what we call the Detroit Wall. And so it's a, if you think of the Berlin Wall, it basically is a version of that. So this, it often gets called that in kind of comparison. So you might hear it called the Burr Wall, the 8 Mile Wall, or sometimes the Wailing Wall is another reference, right? And so it was, I think what you would see is really the starkest example of segregation, right? And I guess not segregation in a way where it's segregation in the sense of we're going to continue to uplift the communities that we live in and that we house, meanwhile divesting and not investing, right, in communities of like Black Americans, right? And so often this barrier was put up in the middle of a neighborhood, right? And so straight through the neighborhood, right, there's a wall, right, to the point where this is a picture of kids, they played on it, right? They played by it like it was just a part of their daily experience. But on the other side were the white residents in that you know, area of Detroit, right? And in an effort to say, we're going to not allow you to live next to us, right? We don't have to see you, right? We can erase you in terms of the ability to construct, you know, buildings or structures around you. And so, you know, I wanted to give that as a part of really, again, the backdrop of saying, okay, this is my own lived experience being a, you know, being ADOS, being Black American, right? And that coming through my family's lived experience, my family's historical experiences, my ancestors. You know, and so, I mean, as you saw within this genealogy piece and this kind of little had a experience of qualitative piece, my dad's not in that picture. So my father, really his side, I'd say probably has been hit harder than really my mother's side by a lot of issues of systemic oppression, right? I'm talking about white supremacy. My father's really information, just going back past even his mother, right? So my grandmother, he didn't even know much about his grandmother. He didn't know much about his mother. Doesn't know anything about his father, right? And so really having a disconnect there, right? And a lot of that coming through violence, right? And so thinking state sanctioned violence, that side of the family really feeling the ramifications of mass incarceration, right? So my father being in jail several times, in and out of jail, and then him having siblings and really half siblings because like different fathers but same mother, a lot of them having incarceration issues too. And I'd say at this point, my father is probably the only one amongst those siblings that's alive. All the rest of the ones that passed, right, as a result of either violent endings or health issues as a result of dealing with systemic oppression and really the manifestations of it. And so with that, I want to show this graph talking about incarceration, right? We're talking about mass incarceration now, right? So we're moving along that timeline, right? We've kind of started to hit, we're now in talking about the redlining and talking about the mass incarceration eras, right? Looking at how the idea that if we don't incarcerate people, then crime goes up, right? Incarceration is the deterrent, right? Well, in reality, crime went down, incarceration still continued to go up, right? And that's been since 1978. And so in the sense that there's not really a link between those two. And I can think of many times where I've heard really like, white individuals who I know or talk to or close to on a regular basis say, well, like thinking with the Black Lives Matter piece, especially police brutality in that sense of, well, I want police to be here, right? I need to be able to call the police because somebody breaks into my house, right? In the sense of saying, well, if you defund the police or do these things, then I'm not going to be safe, right? But what we really see is incarceration and that system isn't really necessarily linked to dealing with crime, right? Like these ideas of being tough on crime, right? And a lot of those crime bills that came into Congress starting in 1978, right, and going forward, really that increase in incarceration rate is segued alongside increase in legislature and policies that were about those race-motivated impairments, right? About policing Black American communities, about the crack epidemic, about all of these pieces. Meanwhile, there were no change in violent crime rates and property crime rates to really substantiate it. Right, so what we see now is, really, Black Americans are often disproportionately likely to be arrested and to be arrested repeatedly in the same year, right? It actually goes up, right, instead of going down, right? Which that would be what we would expect normally, right? Because as you can see with, white populations, it actually goes down, right? Like, and that makes me speak to my own family experience, right? Knowing many of the Black men in my family being arrested and booked multiple times in a year. My father being arrested and booked multiple times in a year. I can remember literally being in a car with him when he was arrested and booked. And then I got handcuffed and I was 10. Right? They're like, we're gonna put you in the back of squad car too, and we're just gonna put some handcuffs on you just because we kind of need to. They didn't necessarily need to. And so thinking with that, like within really that mass incarceration system, that school to prison pipeline, just the industrial complex of it, we often see within pre-trial. So before something actually goes to trial, disproportionately Black and Hispanic populations, folks tend to it goes up, right? And so in the sense of what we're saying is, if you're Black and Hispanic, you're more likely to be detained before trial, right? So thinking like when they say, okay, bail, bond, they're like, nope, throw them in, right? And so we're already going to put you in that convicted space, right? We're going to add you to the jail population, right? And then on the way to adding you to the prison population, right? So again, really drives that system of mass incarceration, right? And so we've seen pretrial jail populations go up since 2002. And so again, just really, again, displaying it differently. So we see within white men in prison, really the rates fluctuate. So most that are in prison in the 30 to 39 range, and then it starts to fall, right? But what do we see with Black men in prison? Those rates start off pretty high, right, compared to white men in prison at the age of 18, right? The starkness in that. And then that just goes even further, right? It does not stop, right? And thinking of many times where, growing up, the message often was, you need to stay out of the streets, right? Stay out of the streets, don't be in the streets, don't do anything that's gonna get you put in jail, put in prison, right? But really, that's kind of a moving target, right? And that metric changes. And it just depends on what is kind of justifiable in that space. And so talking about really these systemic institutions, we also have to talk about, okay, where within our fields do we see this, right? Like the APA released their apology, their resolutions talking about racism, within the United States and really how they contributed towards things. But I really kind of also want to contextualize that further by really displaying how does that still continue to show up to this day, right? So we think of scientific racism, right? And so really the sense of being able to say race is a viable construct because there are biological differences, right, between folks of like Negro background, right, and then folks at the time, what it would be called is Caucasian background, right, and all of that really to establish a belief system to proliferate the sense of slavery, right, to be able to say that, okay, this group is just more brutish, so it's not an issue that we have them doing all this work because they're built for it, right? It's like, and I think of how we often look at creatures too, right? We say sometimes the same thing about animals, right? Well, he's built for that, he's so used to that, it doesn't really matter, right? And just, but as we know, other species have feelings too. Other species have, anxieties, fears, right? Other species have needs too, right? And so, but if we treat ourselves that way, we're not going to treat other beings differently, right? And so that being, I think, where that ecopsychological link starts to show up too, and how we use animals to say, okay, you're less than human, so then that means I can do anything to you. Right, so this is a picture, 1933, right? So these would be, I mean, really the essential of academics, right? These are professors at, various institutions, Ivy League institutions. These are professors at Harvard, going out and saying, well, okay, well, I'm going to go do a study to see, how do we justify this, right? What's the difference here? And so this is a picture, and you may have seen this picture before. And so this individual, he was a slave. His name was Papa Rinty. And he's often really, if you look up scientific racism, if you look up the slave photos, where there's photos of slaves stripped down naked, right, and just them, he is one of them. And so what we know is like institutions, so Harvard, University of Virginia, and other, again, higher educational institutions in the US than white supremacist institutions were a staple because they were the ones that helped develop this scientific biological racism really basis, which goes into like the eugenics movement, right? In the sense to be able to say, okay, well, if we can say that you're not people, then maybe we can start saying that some other mixes of folks aren't people either, right? It just makes it easier to dehumanize. And so in 1850, so in those photos that you saw with the label 1933, one of them was a professor by the name of Louis Agassiz, and he was commissioned to do a series of photographs for the study of races. Right, and so he got a photographer, and he's like, hey, let's go take these photos. Right, and so they took photos around like Columbia, South Carolina. And then those subjects were really a mix of African and American born slaves, male and female, but that being a very intentional piece. And he was a renowned Harvard zoologist and professor. And so, again, institutions, right, are how white supremacy culture and things show up. And they show up in people and show up in interpersonal exchanges, right? I think through microaggressions and things, but we also really see it show up in our institutions. And so what ended up happening was, so this woman's name is Tamar Lanier. And so she is the descendant of Papa Renti. She was able to trace her lineage back to him and actually find documents that link the, succession of births and marriages to say, no, this was my grandfather. And so to her, he was not very far from, that's not very far from slavery. Right? This was her grandfather. And so this is her great-great-great-grandfather. So, and so as a part of that, she said, well, I want those photos. And she said, Harvard, can I have those photos back that you have? So far, Harvard has said no. They said, we own those. Like, we came across those fair and square. And so at this point, she's really engaged in a legislative legal battle to try to say, like, you don't own that. That is my ancestor. So by default, I own that. That is our family's history. Right. And so really seeing how just, again, that legacy of A, erasure, and B, saying, A, this didn't happen. B, now we being put in a space where then kind of being gaslit, right? And having other obfuscation and just other tactics to say, well, this isn't something that you should try to pursue. All right, but this is her family. And so thinking how, again, that's part of really the context when I think of talking about lineage and history and talking about witnessing it, in the sense that it's also a painful history, right? But it's an important history to be able to link to, right? And I think for most people, right, and a lot of clients I work with, who are ADOS Black American, they're really trying to reconcile, okay, what has happened to my family and how that's impacted me, but how that's also a result of what's been done to my family, right? And so simultaneously maybe being really angry at their family because of the enactments, right? Because of the maladjustments that show up, but then also not knowing how to place that because of, well, that also is a result of really 400 plus years of oppression, right? And so it's both, right? And being able to helping someone hold this space, I think is important. And so there's actually a movie right now. It's called Free Renti. So Tamara Lanier has put out this movie to really show, like, hey, this is what my story is. This is what's happening. It's online. It's also, you can schedule screenings of it and things like that as well. But really for the purpose of being able to talk about really America's failure to acknowledge the cruelty of slavery, right? And really those white supremacist institutions that are still active today. And so this is a picture of a hospital, I believe, within Virginia. And so this was actually like a mental hospital, right? And so again, now getting a little deeper into the psychological context, right? Like, this is where the APA starts to show up in their apology, right? And this idea of, like, yeah, we've also got a hand in this too, right? Many institutions. And so seeing that, so back in, was it 1932, was the Tuskegee Airmen experiment. Right, and so what people don't know is that that research went on for 40 years. That was 40 years of telling those men that they were being cured of syphilis and watching the ramifications just slowly happen. Right, and so more than 100 men died as a result of that. And then it was done in collaboration with Tuskegee University. And so it took, they went to Tuskegee University, which is, historically Black college. And so they said, oh, yeah, we need 600 Black sharecroppers. And so they're like, okay. With over half having non-symptomatic syphilis. And so they were promised free medical care. They were told, yeah, you'll get the medical care you need. You just got to participate in the study. And so University of Virginia alumni, so the man in this picture is actually a professor from the University of Virginia. Actually, no, sorry, this is the Surgeon General of the US Public Health Service. So at the time, Dr. Hugh Smith Cummings was the one saying, yeah, we're gonna do this study. Like, yes, we need to do this study. So can you imagine the Surgeon General of the United States right at that time saying, yeah, we need to do this study on these Black American soldiers, right? And so again, institutions being how a lot of this gets enacted, right? And so really they took that eugenic racism right into that community. Right, and so we found that really that idea of eugenic racism then and healthcare led to the segregation of African Americans into the basement wards. And so, like I said, this is University of Virginia's teaching hospital, right? And so now we're placing all of our Black American ADOS patients on the bottom floor, right, where no one can see them, where they're stacked on top of each other in the hallways. Right, so again, seeing how, as a result of what the institutional policies and the white supremacy culture manifests, and then that impact that it has on Black American communities, right, and continued impact. Right, so now we're getting into really talking about healthcare system, right, and again talking about psychology's role within that. And so this is a picture of US Army recruits taking an intelligence test. So this was like Fort Lee in Virginia in 1917. So if I think really, we're between that era of, we're between the end of, slavery and really starting to get into the Jim Crow era. Right, and so with that, so here's a quote from Turkheimer in 2017. We start by noting that we accepted as facts many claims that are controversial in the academy, if not in psychology, that IQ exists, that it predicts many life outcomes, that there is a gap between Black IQ scores and white IQ scores, that IQ is at least partially heritable, as is almost every human trait. We rejected the conclusion that Murray and Harris say is virtually inescapable, that it follows that the Black-white difference in IQ must be partially genetic. Right, and so the danger in saying and really insinuating that genetic piece is this racialized, right? And it really just harkens back to the scientific racism, the eugenics racism. Right, this was in 2017. That was a quote from an article where these individuals were having a conversation about this. Right, to the point where you're still having a conversation about this. Right, even though people said no, there's no good reason to think there's differences there due to genes, and people are like, it may be though, it might be there. Right, you're talking about again a manifestation of white supremacy culture. right? So thinking IQ scores, right? Thinking about how Stanford Binet, right? Intelligence testing was systematically used to say, okay, Black children do not learn as well. They are not as bright, and so they need to be in their own spaces because they can't keep up with white kids, right? And so it just really proliferating a lot of the Jim Crow era policies, right? And so this is what APA is talking about. Right, this is only like the tip of the iceberg in terms of what they're trying to apologize for. And so this is, I mean, literally a photo of a eugenic health fair, right? Like thinking back within, this was in 1920s Kansas, right? So town fair, there's a eugenic stand, right? So we just need to, I mean, as you can see in the bottom right corner, there's a little area for Negro, foreign born, native born, right? So, but really this idea of like, okay, and there's the either or thinking, right? Either you're literate or you're illiterate, right? And there's those characteristics of white supremacy culture just showing up, right? And all of those pieces, the power hoarding, and I'm like, well, if we're the ones that have the higher IQ, then we have all the right to access all the things, right? And that means you don't have any right to access these things, right? So seeing how this shows up in ways of thinking, right? And kind of talking about black bias, right? If you're talking about like that idea of implicit bias, really you're talking about the manifestations of white supremacy culture. And so this was a map of the United States back in 1935. So legislative status of eugenical sterilization in the United States. So as we know, the United States was moving towards legalizing eugenics, legalizing forced sterilization. Right, and so seeing a lot of the places where most places had laws in effect. And sometimes some of those laws are still there. Right, we know legislatively people don't necessarily go back in and say, well, we're gonna just erase this and change this thing and we're gonna fix this language. People often leave things to be dead, but really it's only until they get life breathed back into them, right, through some kind of, I think, racialized policy or someone trying to access some kind of racialized policy. So this leads me to Black Americans' mistrust of medical researchers and the healthcare system stems from structural and systemic factors spanning 4 centuries. Inequities in healthcare, access to healthcare, health insurance, negative encounters with healthcare professionals, right? Generational trauma around medical racism, right? In the sense of when we see that now with, I think, the vaccines, right? In the sense of really seeing folks say, I don't trust vaccines. Well, yeah, probably because, there's many times where folks in your own history, maybe in your own family lineage, were told things. Like I, for instance, know, so my great grandmother, so Big Mama 2.0, ended up dying while in medical care. So she ended up going into a diabetic coma while she was in the hospital. And hospital was like, oh, well, we didn't know she had that. But then they didn't do anything actually. They didn't do anything after that. So she ended up passing away after slipping into that coma. Right, and then other examples of my family going through healthcare systems in Michigan, right, and having really inadequate care. So my uncle, who actually passed several years ago, he passed of heart failure, but it turned out that his doctor was actually not really addressing the issues and addressing the signs leading up to that. But you're not going to see someone really, it's not going to go towards medical negligence because no one's going to be able to say anything because you're really also looking at the the bias, the negative perceptions that people have, right? And then they're enacting those. Right, so this goes to us as therapists, right? So now, again, this hits home because clients walk in and they say, I don't know if I can trust you. You're a healthcare professional. You're here to just enact the same systems and same institutions, right? And so being able to know this context is also what helps us set ourselves apart. Because if you can actually speak to these pieces, then someone will maybe take notice of that. Right? Often where instead, like, you know, like the current trend of trying to work with folks on vaccine hesitancy, for instance. Well, it's like, yeah, on that note, but you're really still not addressing the lived experience of these systemic issues, right? So you're erasing in that sense to try to get somebody to kind of follow the line, right? And Black Americans, that's not, folks don't want to do that because it's never worked out. Right? So it's really about kind of how do we empathize with where folks are coming from. You have to understand the context that they're coming from. You have to see it. So when it comes to attitudes towards seeking mental health services, more than 80% of Black Americans are very concerned about the stigma associated with mental illness. Right? In the sense of thinking back to that eugenics racism. Right? If somebody is having mental health issues, right, then that means we can put you in an institution. Right? There was a point in time where literally mental health institutions, state hospitals, were forms of enacting state violence. Right? We're going to declare somebody insane, and maybe based off of the fact that they're not buying into the traditional, slave mentality. They're not, they're speaking out in a way that seems kind of off, right? And so now we're gonna get them committed. Right, and then okay, that means someone's out of the way potentially, right? And I think of many times in history where that's been used that way. So again, psychology itself being used to enact racial disparities, being used to oppress populations. And so this goes back to that I was talking about earlier in that article. So relative to white patients, Black patients were less likely to receive any pain medicine for moderate pain, and were less likely to receive opioids, the appropriate treatment for severe pain. Right, and I can say that really, I think, relates back to perceptions of the crack epidemic, right? In the sense of saying, I don't know if we can trust you with this medication because, your group tends to, we've seen some things, right? And so really going off of a lot of ill-conceived notions, stereotypes, right? And the bias. But these are your medical professionals, these are your doctors. Right? If you're sitting there in front of your doctor and like, hey, I'm really in a lot of pain. I think I need some pain medication. And they're like, no, you don't need any pain medication, right? Like you got this. This should be like, what's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Someone says 9. You're like, well, is it really a 9? I mean, it seems high. I guess it's a 9, right? In the sense of we're going to minimize and we're going to, again, erase, what somebody is experiencing. And so again, that goes back to that mistrust too of healthcare systems and professionals. Right, and then we get into pregnancy-related deaths, for Black American ADOS women, right, and being 3 to 4 times higher, right, than white women, regardless of the level of education. Right, and so in that sense of being like the birth experience is a potentially dangerous experience. And that's something that we don't see talked about, but that's also, again, that's related to that medical racism, right? Of things like, well, you're tough skinned, you experience less pain, so you don't need that epidural. You sure you need an epidural? Right? And just really pushing a lot of those stereotypes and perceptions. So as we know, African American women are 60% more likely to have high blood pressure. as compared with non-Hispanic white women. Right, and so seeing how this is how this manifests in the body, right? If this is what you've experienced and genetically you've experienced, right? In the sense that we know epigenetic memory is very real, right? And so what your ancestors experienced in forms of trauma can show up in your genes, right? Generations later, right? And so the more and more that we have there, the more likely that is to show up in some way, right? And so things like high blood pressure, chronic inflammation, mental health challenges, right? All of this really being, okay, now there's at some point where the manifestations in people of intersecting with these white supremacist institutions has to start showing up somehow. And so as a part of that, we know that it's really also the rising income inequality. And that's really a part of this picture too. Right, so the median, Black American family is the 35th percentile of income. Right, but as inequality rises, as inflation rises, that median income keeps dropping, and it's dropping drastically. Right, and so really seeing how, due to really economic divestment, literally plunder in a lot of cases, right, and not having that offset, now always still being subject to, anytime there is a difficult time, you're going to feel that 5 times more or 10 times more. And so this is a quote from Jason in 2020, so the individual who shared these pillars of white supremacy. And so concentration of poverty was a natural result of redlining and the ensuing residential segregation. With concentrated poverty came essentially potent colorblind impairment. Right, and so if people are in poverty and you say, okay, now we're gonna give you all the stimulus, you're really just proliferating those colorblind impairments, right? If it's not based in really offsetting all of the economic disparities that were really induced. And so for colorblind benefits, the issue is that pre-existing gaps in wealth, opportunity, and privilege mean that equal allocations widen the gap. So every time at that point we say, we're just going to give everybody the same thing, and if we keep giving you a stimulus check, then that should help, right? No, it actually widens the gap, because you're not, if people already don't have the money to afford things, that money that comes in is already eaten, right? It's already allocated, or it already has to go somewhere, right? But then for folks who don't have those issues, they get to pocket that, they get to sit on that, they get to build wealth, have opportunities, other things, right? So it just actually widens the gap. And so if we're talking progressive policies, it means addressing sources of disparities, right? Actually talking about chattel slavery, actually talking about Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration. And so in that sense of actually wanting to do some form of reparative justice, right? And I think also ecological justice, right? If you're talking about environmental justice issues too, as they are with that, and they are with this, as we're going to talk about shortly, these are parts that have to be tackled at the same time. Right, and so we know only 2% of psychiatrists and 4% of psychologists in the United States identify as Black, right? And if we're even talking Black Americans, it's probably less, making it a challenge for 13.2% of Americans who identify as Black to find someone who looks similar for mental health care. I deal with that currently with clients, right? Like if somebody can't see me and you're trying to find, a Black American therapist, who I can refer to outside of that is not super huge, right? And then you're dealing with folks already having their own caseloads, right? And so really becomes this lack of access again, right? And that being really proliferated to economic and educational disparities. And so this is a picture of what they call the racial dot map. And so this is the racial dot map of southeastern Michigan, like where I am right now. And so what you see here is there's a very concentrated population of Black people within Detroit and the immediate surrounding suburbs. And then everywhere outside of that is overwhelmingly white. Right, and this is really the historical result of redlining, right? Of folks not being able to buy houses in communities, right, or being charged more, right? We even see that now in the sense of, and it doesn't matter regardless of the wealth status, the status with education, status with money. There's an article that just came out recently where a Black couple bought a home for like 1.3 million or something like that. No, 1.7 million. And the house had only appraised for like 1.3 million. So they were actually charged more for the house. And they got a lot of money, right? And there's this idea of like, if you're rich, then you're not exposed to this, right? It's only a matter of class. It's like, oh, it's not a matter of class. It's really, again, a matter of race. And really, in that sense, I'd say more than that lineage, right? It's about the lineage related to chattel slavery. Right, and so the racial dot map, there's actually several, right? So it's a website, you can look it up online. And they have racial dot maps of other cities within the country as well. So you can see the kind of the breakdown. I always say, if you're talking about learning context and working with your clients, you need to know the context of your area. You need to know the history of your area, because your clients probably already know that history because they've lived it, right? And so you being able to understand the history of somebody who comes in terms of really that sociocultural history and that history of them in the area, I think helps people feel very seen, right? Because you can talk about events and you can really relate to people's experiences, right? If we're talking again about witnessing, and witnessing, I think, being a part of that healing process, humanistically too, we have to be willing to witness these pieces too. Right, and so again, thinking of, housing discrimination that still goes on today, right? A home that a Black family is trying to sell might only go for 300,000, whereas a family that's white, that'll go for twice that. Right, and that is actually something that has happened, right? And this is redlining. Right, it still happens to this day, right? Even though it's outlawed, right? Even though housing discrimination is outlawed, right? In the sense that it's not necessarily about outlawing or saying yes or no to something. It's about addressing, the impact. And so, I think as part of kind of wrapping this last piece up, so this is a picture of really the National Guard. And so this goes to the race riots in 1943 within Detroit. So Detroit had 2 race riots. Right? People only really typically know of one. But the first one was in 1943 because and so the inception of that was really a small exchange. So on what ended up happening as a result of this was there was a lot of tension within the city. Because of like what I said, that migration, right? Like my great grandfather moving up north to work in factories. People moved in such vast numbers that the city couldn't accommodate that. Not everybody could get jobs in the factory, right? And Black Detroiters were still seen as second-class citizens, even though they were in the north, right? And so they got disproportionate, really impacts related to wartime rationing, right? And the overall strains on the city. They felt it more, right? And so it swelled into a point where, people were really split into enclaves. So you had a lot of Black American communities within Detroit, like these concentrated communities, because everybody's being pushed there. Everybody's being pushed to move in those spaces. And so people often really being crammed into 60 square blocks on the city's east side. So this was known as Black Bottom in Detroit. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But there were, I mean, there was a large blowout, really June 20th, 1943. Over, 100,000 people were walking, trying to protest. But then what ended up happening is violent groups started to kind of happen, right? And so you had black and white tension, right? And then it created groups starting to fight throughout the city, right? And so then turned into mobs. And so the National Guard was called, right? And so that was the first time. The city did not recover from that. And so Black Americans living below the poverty line are twice as likely to report psychological stress, serious psychological stress, as those living 2 times above the poverty line. Right, and so then that brings us into the next riot in 1967. Right, this was different. It lasted 5 days. People rioted in the city for 5 days. The National Guard had to be called in. Right, because of that. And so over 7,000 people were arrested, more than 1,000 buildings were burned. Right, a lot of Black-owned businesses were burned, right? And so really seeing how this also catalyzed a very militant side, like in that sense, like with the Black Power movement. But noticing, okay, these were so first being pushed into enclaves, and then having those enclaves dispersed and destroyed, right? And through various environmental and state sanctioned kind of violent acts. And so that brings me to the last part, is really talking about the environment, right? So looking at how systemic racism impacts the environment. Right, so this is a picture of an area, I can't necessarily remember the exact area, but on the left is the suburban, predominantly white community. On the right is the impoverished red line community, right? So what we found is, so a large meta-analysis and several other studies, like in 2020, Shell et al. Found that redlining in communities was linked with decreased biodiversity in communities, decreased green space, decreased blue space, decreased access to various routes of parks, and also linked to just the air pollution, right, and pollutants within those areas, right? And so some redline communities tend to have higher aspects of that, right? And so that's really the manifestation of systemic racism. But then we see it impacting the environment, right, and harming also the environment at the same time in parallel. And so Dr. Robert Bullard was the first really kind of ADOS scholar to really talk about environmental justice in the literature. He did a lot of work in terms of bringing publicity, bringing awareness to various toxic dumpings, pollutions of various Black American communities across the nation. And so this was a community in Louisiana. They were protesting the establishment of the PVC plant. Right, and so we know PVC plants are correlated with higher rates of cancer and higher chronic health issues. It took them 2 years to have that recognized. They had to fight for 2 years before and really what happened is the company gave up. The company said, okay, we're going to stop trying to do that. It wasn't really because of the focus of some kind of institutional policies or institutions stepping in. So the question there is, how do we focus on reparative justice from a socio-ecological standpoint? And why is this important for mental health? So what we know is talking about environmental pollutants and justice issues. So going back to like Royal Township, where my family's from, right, and just Detroit, where my family is from, and even surrounding areas, there's always been a connotation in my family to not trust tap water. Long before any of this Flint water stuff, my family's always been very, very suspicious, right? In the sense of there is literally generational, historical elements there that people are already adverse to. Right now we're finding that there's tons of lead service lines. And Michigan has one of the highest in the country. It has one of the highest amounts of lead service lines still left, like, that people are using, right? So thinking about Flint and other places like that as well. That's how this relates to air pollution, right? So we know that air pollution is also related to mental health issues, right, and stress. We also know that the more incarcerated people we have, the more CO2 emissions we have, right? So in terms of climate impacts, mass incarceration drives climate, right? It's a driver in its own way. Still seeing things like asthma deaths, right, related to COVID. Like we know nearly 1/4 of US deaths from COVID, the race is known, it's Black Americans. Right, and Black Americans are more likely than white Americans to report persistent symptoms of emotional distress, but only 1/3 receive the mental health care they need. Right, in the sense of not being heard, right, and not feeling like they can be heard. You know, it reminds me of a quote from James Baldwin that says, the American Negro has had to accommodate a vast amount of, let me see if I have, a vast amount of hatred since he's been here. Thinking environment as a vehicle, right, in the sense of saying, again, that animalistic sense, right, like, ooh, nature is bad, right, and so we will relate Black people to nature, right? And so in this photo, it says, why doesn't your mama wash you with fairy soap, right? If you are clean, you won't be dirty, so that means you won't be Black. Pure, right, purity, and so again, that white supremacist kind of culture. And so these are photos of Black Bottom. Like how I said, one of those communities, right? This is one of those Detroit communities. And really seeing how it was a really bountiful area that was systemically divested and ripped apart, like bulldozed through for construction of freeways and such. Right, and just thinking how we're dealing with economic plunder. African-American music, you know, Black American music being a huge part of American music in general, you know, and where is that credit given? You know, Little Richard being a huge aspect of rock and roll, not really given the credit. And Black inventors as well, right? And here being a list of Black inventors, still not being given credit. Right, and so these racist experiences being an increase in that inflammation. And so if we're talking about promoting health, you know, and just wrapping up with this last piece. Again, it means acknowledging that trauma that's there historically and that systemic oppression through the anti-Black racism, advocating for environmental, educational, legal policies, right, as us as being not only health professionals, but public health professionals, and promoting connection with nature based on what the individual finds comfortable, right, finding ways to relate to the environment. Exploration of those clients' experiences, using that culturally informed praxis, being engaged civilly, promotion of that creative maladjustment, as noted by Dr. King, learning that context of the area, like I talked about. So a lot of these are things I've already brought up before, but just seeing it kind of all wrapped into one. And then therapeutically, considering that we really want to promote agency, empowerment, align with our clients, right? I think of Mustaka's being in, being for, being with, right? We're aligning with our clients and moving with them, right? So that means seeing their realities, which is not always easy. No, we don't have time for case examples, so that's it that I have for that point. So I know we're running low on time, so there's some book readings that I would often recommend. And then I can always give these later too. And then references. Thank you. That's, I know we're kind of running out of time. I don't really want to do questions if we don't have time, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll just put out there for everybody that yeah, as much as there will be a kind of like social hours starting over, but for anyone who wants to stick around and ask Derrick some questions, if Derrick's open to it, by all means, go for it. Yeah, and if you don't mind me just putting it out there for those who are looking for like when you guys are done with questions, in the vConference platform, if you click the chat lounge, and then there will be a button in the upper left for the conversation hall. The conversation hall is where the audio video stuff happens. So sorry, just for that logistics piece. Thank you very much, Derrick. This was awesome.
I'm glad to have been here.
Are we able to get your reference list?
Yes. So I'm hoping I will also give folks the PowerPoint too, if folks want to take a look at it. But yeah, I'm happy to share the references too. I'll send it to you.
Derrick, what really stood out to me was how you said that from an existential point of view, that Black Americans' existence as humans is wrapped up in their experience of oppression and white supremacy. And to me, that also means then that white Americans' existence is wrapped up in their privilege of white supremacy. And I just wonder, I've never been trained that way, and I don't even know how to begin to implement that into my clinical practice, but that stood out to me as so vital and so important.
And I think that's one of those pieces of it that's like the importance of the praxis, because it's not something that we can just say, okay, we do one thing and it's over. Like it's proliferated through all aspects of life, and that is something that is hard, I think, to stomach because it means you can't really get away from it. Right? Like it's always going to be there. But then that's also for Black Americans, like that's just kind of what we know, right? In the sense that we know that it's going to be there, and learning how to do things in spite of that, right? And that being really a part of our, I think, experience growing up. That being a huge part of my experience growing up. And so it's just a different perspective because of that privilege.
Yeah, Derrick, what Vanessa was saying, I'd like to find some way to keep that conversation going. It's very interesting in terms of agency, existentialism, and different situatedness. This past summer, I taught a comparative class where we used the Latin American Latinx philosophy, talking about Mexica existentialism, which in there also talking about the mediation of the structure in between agency and place, and reliance on permission, and that whole aspect of permission and agency. There's just so much more, I think, to think through and talk about that. So it's been gnawing on me since you said it, similar to what Vanessa was saying. That kind of thing. But what's interesting, what also came to mind are when I'm working with clients that are of color, who are trying to exercise agency and liberation, but often find themselves with an inherent pullback, and it comes out in dreams. Like there in the dreams, there's not a freedom to go forward. There is a subjugation that shows up in the dream, like serving somebody rather than having the meal themselves, for instance. That's how deep it is. And I think that I just find, I'm just talking out loud now, but I just, I think that's, Derrick to the next conversations.
Yeah, I found myself hoping there was going to be an answer somewhere, but what I really found, Derrick, and you like being vulnerable enough to share your family story with us, was that it really embodied how relevant that existence related to white supremacy, related to oppression is, that you can't escape it, that it's part of the family context, it's part of the lineage, and it is there. And then when I come in as a white therapist, as a white American therapist, then I'm coming in with a different existential context then. And so when I come in with my knowledge base and my experiences of what interventions to choose, then if I don't have an awareness of the other person's historical context, then I'm doing a huge disservice when we're not able to connect in that I thou authentic way without that there.
And it can come in such unwitting, benevolent ways. I was working with an African-American man whose house was, there's a lot of shady stuff, of course, in Chicago, like everywhere else. And so he was wrestling with the water company, and they were, doing things to him with the situation that just were clearly unjust. And he was trying to live without water. And so I'm thinking, God, I don't want him living without water. So I said, well, why don't you just sell the house? And I was quickly educated about how long it takes for a Black man to save enough money to buy a house as related to a white man who, how long it takes to save enough money to buy a house, and just how those are some of the intangibles I was overlooking. It's just, but I think but what I appreciate with your presentation, Derrick, is just the concrete things to grab hold of and run with.
Derrick, thank you for such a presentation that's, just replete with so many different pieces dealing with Black culture. And you mentioned Fanon. I just recently read where Fanon, and I paraphrase, that he said that Black people are stuck in slavery, and that troubled me, and that we're so stuck that even when it comes to needing to just simply relax, we don't fully relax, in that we're perpetually tired. And so you doing this presentation and going so deep into it, and even to include your family, I know that it required perhaps more work than what outwardly shows. One of the things that I wanted to ask in reference to family, I found it refreshing that you mentioned your great grandfather, but you did mention your father was missing, and so I wanted to, if you could maybe just elaborate a little bit on the missing father, the Black male, because there's a difference. Most of our families are very matriarchal because the Black male is missing. So what has happened to the Black male?
That's a good point, and I think that's why I like there was a book in one of the suggestions, The Man Not, because it talks about that experience of wanting to be like, or being told to be accessible of all the privileges of being a white man, but you're not. And so you don't get those in the end, but you get a strange version of that, right? And so but then everyone puts you in the same camp, right? And so kind of creates more of the disparities, right? Because you're comparing apples and oranges sometimes.
Sure.
right? In that sense of like so my dad, he, like, to this day, every year of my birthday, he will text me. He will tell me happy birthday. And that's probably all that I will hear from him. Like, if I start to try to talk to him and engage him, I usually don't get very much, right? Because he's just generally, he's been through so much trauma that he doesn't even know what kind of trauma he's been through. Right? And he just got to the point maybe 10 years ago where someone was like, I think you have PTSD and pieces like that. And he never really, I think, followed up with those kinds of services, right? For the same kind of reasons of mistrust and stuff like that. And so anytime I try to get records for his side of the family, they don't exist. Looking for my great grandmother on that side, I get a lot of diffuse records that none of them really point back to her, right? Distinctively, it's kind of like, this might be her, but we don't know. The birth date's kind of the same. It's maybe a little different. Like, this is a little different. So you never, because I don't have actual context on that side. So he was raised by really, so kind of like a family friend. And so the family friend took in my father and all of his half siblings and raised them all, right? And so he was kind of the keeper of some of their family stuff, but recently he's been, he had passed recently. And so all of that really oral knowledge is gone. Whereas I have more of that oral knowledge on my mother's side, just because it was housed in women. So all the men, if you notice, are still on my mom's side, are still absent, or dead, or stuff like that. So they're still in that space too, right? It's just the family story is carried through the women who are living. There's no women living on my dad's side. So his side really is really the result of complete erasure, right? There's just, it's almost a total erasure. Like, I still can't find much, or I can't talk to him. There's no one to talk to on his side that can actually, impart you with that kind of wisdom or knowledge or anything.
It makes me wonder, as a Black man, where is the hope? As a Black man, where is the hope?
I guess for me, that goes to, I think, collective, right? So I think of really that idea of the collective uplift, right? In the sense of saying, really, it's about Black American people coming together and being like, we are Black American people, right? And our lineage is slavery, and we can take that and we can own it, right? Instead of having that be something that we run from, because it's a part of us. Our Black identity is rooted in that. And people are scared of that. People tend to not like when that gets acknowledged. So I think that's the importance of it. And the saying, like, that's the existential piece, right? Like saying, this is here. It hurts. There's a lot of suffering. But this is part of who I am, and I'm not letting that go, right? Like that idea of that James Baldwin quote, like I think Black Americans are still trying to get the country to pledge allegiance. Still been trying to get the country to pledge allegiance to us over again.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I don't want to keep folks. I know folks are probably, it's a Friday night. Like, I'm always happy to keep talking if folks want to keep talking, but. Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, no. That's like, this is years in the making. Yeah, this is taking me years of, like, I think, internal work to be able to hold a space while talking about all of this, and not like going into like some like screaming fit or something, or like just like losing my mind trying to talk about it. So it does take a lot. So thank you all for being here. Yeah, I appreciate I appreciate that, and I appreciate your willingness to kind of be involved. Oh, I'm being invaded by a small dog. So apparently that's my time. She's looking at me. Oh.
Right, and I'm to be very firmly reflect the meaningful and to do the field list and use some of it. So thanks for doing.
I think I caught part of what you're saying. You know, it seems like maybe the video is maybe lagging. So sometimes if you turn your video off, then it makes the audio clearer.
Yeah, Ron, we didn't hear anything you just said.
Mm-mm.
I think it might be lagging pretty bad.
Doing well.
You can always typing in the chat. That may be easier.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry, Ron. We can't really understand you at all.
Yeah, it's coming in really choppy right now for whatever reason.
thank you for the three you more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm logging off. Bye.
I thank you all. I think it's
Thank you, Derek. Well done.